Thank you, Dharmasara. A lovely introduction. I'm very happy indeed to be here. And before I say another word, I just want to check, can you hear me at the back? Amalagaba, can you hear me? Yeah. So if my voice drops, as it sometimes does, please wave. It'll remind me, okay? So yes, I am very happy to be here. The Dharma in English on Saturday mornings at the Berlin Buddhist Center is famous in our movement. The reputation of this class has gone before it, and now here I am sitting with the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, which I hope you'll find interesting. Well, I'm going to start off with a question. What brought you to Berlin? What brought you to Berlin? So, probably one or two were born here, but just out of interest, anybody here born in Berlin? A few. Oh, good. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. But not many, so everybody else came here at some point. And you may have come here for work, you may have come here for family reasons, you may have followed your lover here, you may have come here out of curiosity, because Berlin has a sort of attraction. It's famous in a way all over the place. And when you live in Berlin, you feel proud to live in Berlin. You feel I'm living somewhere with something a bit special. So I don't know what brought you to Berlin, but in the year 2000, a book brought me to Berlin. So you have to imagine it was a quite old book, had brown covers, and it was a handwritten book in the old Gothic German, so I couldn't read it. If you've ever seen Gothic script, I couldn't read it. And it had photographs. And that same book had left Germany sometime after the war. It had gone to England, and now, with some emotion, I was bringing it back. And I took it to the Literaturhaus in Fasanenstraße. It's a cafe, really, where I think great literary figures sometimes met. And I handed it to a publisher. He was going to bring it out as a book with a very small publishing company that only existed for 2 years, called the Jüdische Verlagsanstalt Berlin, the Jewish Publishing Society of Berlin. And he did indeed bring it out. It became published as Gut Shabbos in 2002, and then very soon after that publishing house disappeared. So that book I took with me 8 years later, to a little place south of Prague called Theresienstadt, or Terezín in the Czech language, Terezín. So many of you may know Theresienstadt was one of the concentration camps, not an extermination camp, but a concentration camp where many elderly people were sent, and also many artists and so on sent. And my great-grandparents, my great-grandfather, Israel Nussbaum, who'd written that book, very Jewish name, isn't it? Israel Nussbaum. He was sent there, also his wife Berta, also his daughter, my grandfather's sister Annie. So I took the book that had been published there and I read it aloud in the cafe area. So I was there where he'd been, where he died. He died within a few months because the conditions were pretty bad and he was quite elderly. And I read it because I wanted to sort of communicate something like, well, your life ended here, but in a way it didn't all end. Something carried on, yeah. So it was very moving and meaningful on some level for me to do that. And I was thinking, had he not written, it was a sort of biographical memoir kind of thing, had he not written that, he would have disappeared. But there's a memory, his life had been saved through his book. So books are very important. Books are very important. I know these days it's internet. I know that, I'm not quite such a dinosaur, I know I'm quite old, but I do know about the internet, I use it, etc. But still, I think books are very important. In this talk, I'm not going to justify the production of actual books, that's for another talk, because I've got other things I think are more important to say. So I want to bring now a different image I want you to imagine, and some of you may have seen this image, a Chinese man, okay, with a big a burden on his back, full of books, and he's walking, and sometimes he's got a tiger by him. Not quite sure how the tiger got in there, but there's a picture at Adhisthana that Dharmasara mentioned on the wall of the library with exactly this picture, and he's got a little tiger walking along with him. Doesn't really look like the tigers we know of, because the artists have probably never seen a tiger, but it was a sort of tiger. And that figure is Xuanzang. So Xuanzang is a 7th century Chinese Buddhist, and by then Buddhism was in China, but there were many different ways it was being taught. And Xuanzang, who'd become a monk, was saying, well, which is the right kind of Buddhism? What was really taught? And he decided he was going to go to the source. Always good to go back to the source, i.e. to India, and see if he could find out what the Buddha really taught. So off he set. Now some of you may made considerable journeys to come to Berlin from your country, I don't know. And you might have come not knowing when you'd go back. It took Xuanzang 17 years to reach India. So he had quite a few adventures on the way, including getting imprisoned and this, that, and the other. But he did get to India, and he studied there. He must have learnt Sanskrit. And he then took books written in the Sanskrit of India back with him to China. I was happening to look on the Wikipedia, and it told me exactly how many books. Imagine that. According to Wikipedia, it was 657. He also took 120 relics, and you wonder he didn't have them all on his back, because 657 books nobody could manage. He had 20 horses, and he took them all the way back to China, and he set up a translations bureau. So he had people all there translating away, talking, how do we translate this term, that term, the other term. And we have something a little bit similar, as Dharmasara mentioned, in our movement called Triratna, where people get together in groups we call them kulas, and they're trying to translate and talking about, well, how do we translate this term into Japanese or Chinese or Estonian or whatever it is. The Buddha himself, actually, in his lifetime, when he was sending out his disciples to go and teach the Dharma out of compassion for the world, for the good of gods and of human beings, gods with angelic beings, which they seemed to experience in those days, sending his disciples out to teach out of compassion for the world, he said, please teach in the vernacular languages, teach in the local languages, do not teach in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit was the language of the Brahmins, and most people didn't know it. So the Buddha was quite clear, teach in the vernacular, in your own local languages. So that's an important sort of precedent in Buddhism. But it raises a very interesting question, because here I have the privilege of just coming in and being able to speak my native tongue. I can do German. I managed a German talk on Monday, but it's quite a bit more demanding for me, and I'm quite limited in what I can say. So once I'm in my own mother tongue, I've got a much broader palette of expression. And all of you speak English. Quite a few of you as a second language. Out of interest, how many is English your second language? Or third or fourth, whatever? Yeah, look at that. So people say, these days, especially for younger people, we all speak English. We do not need translations anymore. Yeah, it's the common language, it's the world language. Wherever you go, it's English. Internet, it's English. Yeah, why bother with translation? So that is a question. And then we have next to that the idea, well, actually, there's a difference if you hear the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, in your mother tongue. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this area because I think it's quite significant, it's important. But we're going to take a bit of a sidestep before we come back to this area. Let me just remind myself. Yes. What I was wondering was, my second question to you, what effect has it had on you hearing the Buddhist teachings? Now, some of you are here for the very first time, so you haven't heard them yet. Or a little bit from Lalita Ratna, because he was slipping them in under the radar, leading meditation in a way. And no doubt in the other group as well. But some of you, or perhaps many of you, have been coming for a few weeks or even quite a long time. So my question to you is, what effect is hearing the Dharma having on you? Tremendous. Yeah. Well, I'll link with that, because I remember when I first heard the Dhamma, I was 23, it was quite a long time ago. And I went along, it was a little student class in a room in a psychology department, actually, and it was so packed with people that the person with the funny thing around their neck had to sit on the table. And when I heard the Dhamma, I can't say whether it was exactly that week or the next week, but over those early weeks, I felt the two things stand out. One is, I felt I was hearing what deep down I knew, I recognized it, but I would never have found the words to say it. So I felt, oh, this is it, yeah? And the other thing, which was hard to explain, I remember going home, I used to feel my mind was on fire. Something was sort of energy somewhere. I couldn't really explain it. So the Dharma can have a very strong effect when it has an impact on us. And this is reflected also when in the Buddhist scriptures, the accounts of the Buddha himself, the Buddha who's the original founder of Buddhism, who lived in the 6th century BCE, before the Common Era. When he used to meet people, I'm going to tell you the effect it would have on them. So he was an enlightened being. What that is a whole other talk. But he had gained enlightenment around about the age of, how old was he?
35.
37 or 35, yeah. Mid-30s.
You're right, you went forth at 27, didn't you?
Okay. 29, that's right. Anyway, mid-30s. Any of you mid-30s? Okay. So he became enlightened around his mid-30s, and he spent the rest of his life trying to pass on what he'd experienced. And he'd often meet people. In those days in India, there were wanderers seeking the truth, a bit like probably a lot of you or a lot of us seeking the truth. And they used to wander around, and they'd go to different teachers and ask them, well, is this the truth, or what do you teach? And people would come to the Buddha. And they'd ask the Buddha all sorts of questions. The Indian mind was quite sort of metaphysical and abstract sometimes. They'd ask this or that, and, is there existence after death or not after death, or both not and after death, or all these questions. And he would answer in different ways. And one day someone went to him and asked about, and this is quite important because you might have heard this idea, is all painful experience the result of bad action, karma? Yeah? They asked the Buddha this question. So they said, this is what I've heard. Whenever you feel anything painful, it's due to your past karma. The Buddha said, no. He said, no, it's not that. He said it might be bile or phlegm. In other words, things going on in your body. That's why if you've got a bad feeling. He also said, I just read this just recently, it can be harsh treatment. I don't know exactly what's meant, but maybe something had happened to you and you're experiencing the sort of repercussions, but it's nothing to do with your actions. Yeah? So that's good to know. But yes, some things we experience is due directly to our own actions. So the Buddha was explaining all this to this wanderer who'd come to him, and he really, really got it. He really got it. And this is what he then said. He said, magnificent Lord, just as if he was to place upright what is overturned, to reveal what is hidden, to point out the way to one who was lost, or to carry a lamp into the dark so that those with eyes could see forms. In the same way, the Blessed One, through many lines of reasoning, made the Dhamma clear. So you can get the sort of energy, magnificent. He's just so happy, and something like the lights become on, or he's something that had fallen down to be put upright. So that was one of the wonders of ancient India. I also wanted to mention Sangharakshita, who Dharmasara mentioned is the founder of our particular community of Triratna. This is him here many years ago. And he had an interesting start to life. So when he was 8 years old, he was diagnosed with a heart condition and he had to stay in bed. And his parents were told if he moved suddenly, he might die. So he was really kept still. Afterwards, it seemed like it was a misdiagnosis. He hadn't got a heart condition. But that's another story. So what he did was he read, and he became a just consummate reader. He loved reading, and he read the whole of the Children's Encyclopedia in 61 parts. And he started to read whatever books he could get hold of. And once he got out of bed and he was back living a normal life again, after he was about 10 or 11, he just read everything he could get his hands on. He'd go to the library, the lending library, and read this and read that. And then as he got older, he started to think, well, I don't need to just read from my own culture. And he read from Japanese, Chinese, Indian, East Asian, as well as Western culture. So he was very, very well read. And when I think Dharmasara might have mentioned, I worked with him during the last years of his life, and when he used to talk about something he'd read, it was so vivid before him. You got the sense he'd entered into that with a full imagination. He sort of entered into the world of these different poetry or history or whatever it was. So when he was, this summer, he became 17. He'd gone to one of the London second-hand bookshops. There's Charing Cross Road, if anyone knows it, there's second-hand bookshops. And he'd found what we call a Mahayana Sutra, the Diamond Sutra. Yeah, the Diamond Sutra. You might have heard of it, one of the famous Buddhist texts, written down quite a long time after the Buddha. It's actually quite obscure to read it for many people, certainly for me. But when Sangharakshita read it, he had an experience where he knew he was a Buddhist. He recognized it. He knew he was a Buddhist, and he says, always have been. He knew he was a Buddhist and always had been. So again, we get the importance of a book. Importance of a book. So the rest of his life, not only was he deepening his own understanding of what we call the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, the Dharma, he was also teaching it more and more to others. And when he began to set this movement up, it began in 1967 in London. When he began that, one of the things he brought in was the relevance of your own culture. So he thought you can see in the best of any culture where it reaches the Dharma and it touches the Dharma. So it's fantastic. There have been many Buddhist teachings coming from the East to the West, but some of them come with a lot of cultural trappings, and people like myself would not have found it easy to find my way into the Dharma, into Buddhism, without feeling I could embrace the best of my own culture. Because I appreciate Western culture. Yeah, just a little divergence. At the end of my delightful visit here in Berlin, I'm going to Jena and Weimar. And I don't know if you know, but Jena was the sort of cradle of the Romantic movement. And I was reading a book called Magnificent Rebels, the same word again, Magnificent Rebels by Andrea Wulf. She's a German living in England, writing in English. She wrote about Humboldt, Alexander, the explorer, in case anyone's read that one. And she writes about the Jena set. So in 1795, you've got these great minds all ended up in Jena, like Schlegel and Schelling and Fichte and Novalis and Schiller, and Goethe was just down the road in Weimar. Hegel came. All these people, they were all there. And of course they were falling in and out of love. That goes without saying around there. But then also talking, trying to tease out in the wake of the French Revolution, which was only a few years before, tremendous sort of shake-up, even more than Brexit, in fact. These people started off what was a tremendously influential movement, the Romantic movement. It influenced the English Romantic movement through the poets Coleridge and Wordsworth, and it went all the way over to America to the Transcendentalists there. So I was thinking about this, and I'm very much looking forward to my little pilgrimage to Jena and Weimar shortly. But I was thinking, well, there's all these people on the Saturday class. I wonder if we've got a sort of something that is going on here, that you're meeting each other from, not just from different parts of Germany, like the Jena set, but from different parts of the whole world. And something is arising, Who knows what's going to come out of it? Anyway, that was a train of thought of mine. But back to what I was saying. Yes, Sangharakshita. So he himself had this strong feeling for culture, not only for the word, but also for the image. He was a bit of an artist himself when he was a boy, and he loved going to art galleries, and he would write sometimes in his memoirs in great detail what he'd seen. He'd got a sort of the kind of imagination that can enter deeply, not only into the word, as I mentioned before, but into the image, yeah. And he talks about going to an art gallery, looking around, which some of you may do, or maybe many of you do that. You look around and you see what draws you, what speaks to you, what image, what grabs your attention. And who knows why? Something speaks to you. And he himself noticed that he was being often drawn to images of this one, St. Jerome. This is from the Dürer exhibition. Well, it's not the original, don't worry. But Dürer, the exhibition was on recently in the Gemälde Gallery, including this picture. Sadly, I just missed it by a few days, but it has been on. So Sangharakshita was drawn to this image, and you may not be able to see it at the back, but what you've got is that you've got an old man, a monk. He's bending over his desk, he's writing. He's got a skull there, and he's got a lion at his feet. So the skull is reminding him of impermanence, we would say as Buddhists, reminding him time is short, he's an old man. And what he's doing is he's translating. St. Jerome is translating, and he's translating the Bible. He's translating the Bible from the Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament into, not English, but Latin. And we call it the Vulgate version of the Bible, into Latin, because Latin was the lingua franca, at least of those who could read and write. It was Latin. And this meant that the Bible could be read by ordinary people. And up till then, it had been only the people who could read Greek and Hebrew. So Sangharakshita, when he's contemplating this image and what's drawing him to it, what it's saying to him, he's saying, well, what St. Jerome had to do was, in a way, draw something out of the darkness that was intelligible to most people and bring it into the light of awareness and understanding for most people, or many people at that time. That's the translator. And he was thinking, well, why is it speaking to me? And he realized, well, he himself was a translator. Not in the literal sense, although he did do a little bit of literal translating, but metaphorically, because he had gone off to India and the East and lived out there for 20 years and had contact with all the main schools of Buddhism. And he brought back what was essential, what he felt was essential to try and communicate the Dharma to people in modern circumstances today, people like us. And he said to do that, in a way, he also was drawing something out of the darkness into the light. Yeah, so that's the translator. Now I thought, we need to make a connection. Well, what's all this got to do with us? Yeah, I hope it's interesting. Someone's going to tell me afterwards whether it was. I hope it's interesting. But actually, what about us and our own lives? Because the Dharma, sometimes we say the Dharma is a personal invitation. It's like the Buddha's saying, look, here's the Dharma, see if it works for you. Try it out, see if it works for you. So, we in a way are translators ourselves. We hear the Dharma, and then we have to put it into practice in our own lives. And the Dharma is there to transform. We say sometimes it transforms body, it transforms what we do physically, how we live, the way we live. For instance, very ordinary example, we might decide, okay, I'm going to stop eating meat because I've become more aware of the suffering involved for animals, for instance, or for the planet. I can do more for the planet if I stop eating meat, for instance. So it's got immediate ramifications for how we actually live physically. And then we say speech. The Dharma transforms the way we speak, the way we communicate. This is a huge thing. We're talking all the time, most of us, quite a lot anyway. But how do we talk? How do we know how to talk? Yeah, how do we communicate? We are social animals. We long to be with others. But sometimes it's not altogether satisfactory. Is that right? We're with them. But it's not altogether satisfactory. So how is there a way we can bring the Dharma, make our communication more satisfactory for ourselves and for other people? So the Buddha's got things to say there. And then the mind. In a way, Buddhism is addressing the mind most of all, which is very, very interesting. I've just been reading a book by an old Indian Buddhist from many, many centuries ago called Vasubandhu. And he, among other things, he developed a school sometimes called consciousness only. Consciousness only, that's quite intriguing. Is that only consciousness? Actually, the answer is we don't know. But it can be a good way of going about things to assume that, in a way, all we know is our own consciousness. So what do we do about it? Can we change it? Can we have an effect on it? Basically, so that life is happier, more meaningful. And yes, we are in touch with something that's beyond the ordinary mundane. Because that's what Buddhism is offering, something beyond the ordinary. Something, the other side, jenseits, as they say in German, beyond our ordinary experience. And perhaps that's an experience you've had that's brought you here also. There's something beyond the ordinary. Now I call the talk The Lion in the Cell. Ben, did you mention that? No. Yeah. And anyway, I was trying to get something a little bit interesting. The Lion in the Cell, because I thought translation doesn't sound that interesting. I thought The Lion in the Cell sounds a little bit more interesting. But then I was reflecting on the lion in the cell, St. Jerome's lion, and I thought actually it is an image we could use, because you may know the story of St. Jerome. He found this lion. He was out in the wilderness praying and doing, what do they call it, hitting himself with stones. What do you call it? Self-mortification, thank you, exactly. Anyway, he saw this lion who's got a thorn in his foot. So usually, of course, lions are ferocious, and you keep they're even worse than the Wildschwein around Berlin, so you keep well clear of them. But St. Jerome was moved by the pain in the lion. He saw the pain, and he took the thorn out of its paw. So what happened? The lion came with him, and he's sitting, he's very tame, he's almost protecting St. Jerome to let St. Jerome do his creative work. And I thought, in a way, this is something for us, because we can sometimes feel we've got all sorts of energies, let's say raw energies, all sorts of painful things. If you go deep down in our psyches, all sorts of things we've inherited from those of us who've got any sort of German background. There's a lot to inherit in there. Well, many countries, we inherit a whole lot. There's a sort of pain deep down there. So the Dharma is offering us to try and help pull that thorn out. It's a little bit longer term and not quite so simple as getting a thorn out of the paw of a lion, but it's an image, yeah, that we can heal, we can become whole, and then those energies that perhaps cause us quite a lot of grief and get us into trouble, they are transformed and become almost like a protector. They're part of us. Yeah. There's a famous line from Shakespeare's The Tempest where Prospero, the magician, in relation to Caliban, who's a sort of monster in a way, he says at one point, this thing of darkness I do acknowledge mine. Yeah, this thing of darkness I do acknowledge mine. And this is part of what we have to do. And Buddhism, again, is offering ways we can do that to become sort of whole human beings. So that's our work of translation of the Dharma into our own lives. Yeah. Alongside, maybe we want to pass it on to other people, helping with translation. And if any of you are interested in translating your language, yeah, come and tell me. Or I'll ask Dhammasara and Lalita Ratna if they can send a link out. Because the more people, this is my view, the more people who hear the Dhamma and are given something to, like a way forward in life, a way that involves all these things I've just mentioned, the more the better. So I think I'll leave us there with the lion in the cell and that talk about translation, literal translation, about how people responded to the Buddha when they heard the Dhamma, asking you how you've been responding when you've heard the Dhamma, and inviting you to get to know your own lion. Thank you very much.